Typically, there's a certain expectation when you open the pages of a comic of what you'll find there. The basics are panels and images and text, right? But within that, normally the panels would be regular shapes that ideally aid and guide the storytelling so it's obvious as to where you need to look next, and typically be fairly unobtrusive. It's a standard of normal storytelling in most commercial mediums. Usually the form of storytelling itself isn't designed to get in the way of the story being told. It's not meant to be a distraction. Neil Gaiman, J.H. Williams, Dave Stewart and Todd Klein's Sandman Overture doesn't abide by that rule though. It almost seems to relish in its own form. Practically every page is unique in the way it presents information, and it constantly asks you to learn and relearn how to read this comic, working to make the format of the book be as much a part of the story as the actual story. So in this episode, I'll take a look at how the opening of the comic does that, how its form infers additional levels of storytelling information while presenting a non-traditional form. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. And I often use the first page of a comic as an example because I find it's a good way for the creators of establishing expectations. This is your very first introduction to this new world, this new space, this new story. So with a good team, it often contains a hint or an idea of what you'll be getting here from this book. So the first page of issue 1 of Overture contains a pattern that repeats throughout the book, with these 3 overlapping circles and its central column of focus down the page. And it sets up exactly what kind of comic and storytelling approach we're going to be seeing. Even from just a glance, you get a sense of something, right? You can see immediately, without reading any text or even really looking at any of its actual contents, that this isn't a traditional oblong panelled comic. It's still reading left to right, top to bottom, but there's something a little bit different about it. So when I see a page like this, my first thought is to ask, why? Why is it being presented like this? Why was the answer to the question of how best to tell this story? Why was it this? In terms of that story content, we're being told about a planet and given snapshots of the planet's life, and these don't come in square or box panels, they're circular. We don't see a ton of circular panels generally in mainstream comics. Often if you do it because the book might be a bit kind of quirky or indie, or you'll see them a lot for inset panels, taking a closer look at something within another panel. But when I see them, especially in this context, I always get the feeling that they come across a bit more organic and less rigid. They're less kind of structured or man-made. The lack of hard corners, I think, helps with that, or straight lines, because it gives the panels a slight fluidity, especially in comparison to something like the final panel where we do get an oblong. It's a nice touch too, because what each of those panels is actually exploring is the life forms on this planet we see right at the top of the page. So by its very nature, it's organic material that we're discussing. And the circles also do link nicely into continuing that visual of those circular planets that we did see. It represents the motif of these different cultures and organisms existing, and their worlds are represented by panels shaped like that planet. They're almost visually floating out in the space around them too. It's like these are 3 planets themselves. The first image we get is Full Bleed, at panel 1 if you will, showing the planet and the star system around it. And that's the circular link I mentioned being key for the other 3 panels on the page as well. And that bleed image helps frame everything else we see here, and it gives the sense of like layers, that everything is framed within the context of this space and this world, not standing alone. You can see how actually each of these 3 panel sizes staggers, going from a small to sort of a medium and then a large. The first change is quite small, it's only a slight increase, but from that middle to the final panel, there's a fairly big step up in size. And that's really interesting because it feels like that should be for a reason, not just because you're progressing down the page. So out of those 3 circles, we're first told about the small-minded humanoids who seem focused on themselves, given a visual of a family and a bit of description. They seem very inwardly focused, they believe their planet is alone in the universe, and their panel reflects this mentality. They're all huddled in together, there's not much of a world around them. And Dave Stewart also brings a fairly natural, earthy palette into it. The background of the world is deep greens, some grey, and the humanoids are muddy, earthy colours. It all works to ground this panel. Nothing pops, nothing is heavily saturated, no wild and beautiful colours, just an honest representation of a limited scope. And that's interesting to call it a limited scope because that's exactly what we know about those characters from the text as well. So we're seeing the colours, the panel choices, the size all reflect the story we're getting in the caption boxes. But that in itself doesn't necessarily say much beyond that. But as we know of comics, juxtaposition is where stories come alive. The bridge from one panel to another, the gap of the gutter, that's always the telling moment. Here's no different, even though we don't have that gutter, we've just got the panel borders. Because next we get insects who can branch out a little further, explore the solar system, make art, but ultimately they come back to their basic needs. So they're still quite trapped by that medium-sized circular panel, but they've got a bit more breathing room. The colours here by Stewart are brighter, a little more saturated, and less grounded than he gave to the humanoids. Interestingly though, the range of colours is still restricted. Its main bulk is just orange and yellow, two colours right next to each other on the colour wheel, with a few splashes of blue and green too. Where Gaiman talks about this race being able to create art, to interact in a way different than just the existence of the humanoids in panel 1, able to branch out of their understanding, they still end up coming back to tiny floating cells interested in egg laying and food. So they're still restricted heavily by something, and J.H. Williams is able to show that in the panel shape he chooses, the panel size he chooses, and Stewart and his palette range. And then we get the carnivorous race of plants. They have one key thing different than the other two races, as we understand it from the description, and that they have beautiful minds. So this panel is bigger, more expansive, more colourful because of that. And that's interesting because we also learn that the plants don't move, they have limited mobility. So even though this is a race that doesn't move anywhere near as much as the other two, they're given a bigger panel, a bigger space to inhabit. And this panel is bigger, it's more expansive, it's more colourful, all because of that. This is a story about Dream, and so naturally we're going to be more interested, and Dream himself is going to be more interested in characters who are able to dream, who think bigger and bolder. It's not just a story point as it is a message about this world, that those who dream, those who wonder, those who think bigger are bigger. Their world is bigger, it's bolder, it's more exciting. Stewart really opens up the palette here, and it's lushly saturated. We've got deep reds, greens, blue, offset against a pale yellow that makes their saturation pop and stand out even more as a contrast. It's the most dynamic and engaging panel on the page because of this combination, and again, it's purposeful, because that is the race that interests our story, and Dream as a character. And this is when we get our first non-circular panel border too, around Corian. Now he actually sits alone from the rest of the page, not just the other plant creatures in this circular panel, but the actual world itself. He's no longer part of that circular representation, but Corian has stepped into an unfamiliar design, a way of visually showing how he's entering the dream world. If we link it back to that idea of organic, circular panels and the edges and corners feeling more constructed, this ties in nicely into that dream world, which is both a construct of Dream, but also of Corian, right? And visually you can really see how this moment is separated from everything else because of that framing, but also because of Stewart's colours. By changing the background colour to a moodier, darker purple, it means Corian doesn't quite pop as drastically as the rest of the panel. It's closer in hue to the green of the plant, and the reds we saw being bold and beautiful are covered up and subdued, and the whole panel is imbued with this sense of calm, fitting with his current sleeping state. So you can see here on this opening page how the creative team all worked to build that page design as a major part of the storytelling itself. The panel borders are not just a way to separate the imagery for clarity, but they're a way to learn more about the characters and the worlds contained within them without needing to bog you down with further exposition. It's also interestingly subjective and almost judgmental of these characters. This book has a message it wants to tell us as the audience, and it doubles down on that effect with the text and the visuals. No doubt in future episodes I'll take a further look at some of the other page designs in Sandman Overture by the great J.H. Williams, but for now, this opening page works as a clever example of a way to build the art in a comic as an organic piece of storytelling in itself, and tell us so much about this alien world in one page and 3 circular panels. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Panel Naked, it'd be great if you check out the Patreon and consider supporting. You'll get access to tons and tons of regularly updated exclusive content on there. For more comics talk and analysis, you can follow me on Twitter @HassanOE, and finally hit subscribe to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.